All right, so where we left off in the last lecture was talking about the CGL, Commercial General Liability Policy, has three parts, A, B, and C. A is the bulk of the coverage where it comes because that's property damage and bodily injury. Coverage B is a subclass of very specific events that we'll talk about, personal and advertising injury. And then coverage C has very low limits because we aren't going to worry about legal liability for this. So we're just automatically going to pay. If somebody gets hurt on my premises or out of a result of my operations, we're just going to pay. We don't care about legal liability. So we got to keep the limits low. Otherwise, people are going to take advantage of that. So that's the difference there. Coverage A is where most of the action happens. So let's go ahead, get into that, see what that looks like. So there's two things they promise. Number one, they will pay whatever damages that you're legally liable for. Remember, that requires a court. And then number two, they will take care of defending you. And that defense cost is typically on top of the overall limit. We'll talk about how limits work because it's a little bit different here. In homeowners, remember, we just had per occurrence limits, and it was just $100,000 per time with the HO3 policy, right? So if you got sued 5 different times, yeah, you had access to that limit 5 different times. We're going to find out in the commercial policy, it's more complicated than that. There are aggregate limits. So you could get sued multiple times and get defended multiple times, but there is an aggregate limit that they will not pay more than in the course of a year. And there's actually a couple different ways that we subdivide that out. That's coming up in part 2. Anyway, so the conditions, yep, you got to be legally liable. It's got to be covered bodily injury and property damage. Some things are excluded, and we'll find out they have P exclusions. That's 16. There are 16 exclusions in the policy. And the way that the industry tests for this kind of stuff, they say, yeah, tell me about exclusion O. And then you're just expected to know which of the 16 that is and how it works. I think that's a bit unreasonable to ask in terms of memorization. So it doesn't bother me if you have to go to your notes to look up some of these ones that we're going to focus on. But there are important things that we'll get to that come out there. Okay, so it's got to be covered. It can't be excluded. It's got to be an occurrence in the coverage territory. So it's got to be something that we can clearly define. This is what happened. So most of the time we're talking about an accident, one-time thing. It's usually pretty clear. But sometimes it happens as a result of repeated exposure to something, for example. Then it gets a little harder. Is that an occurrence? And so we have to look pretty closely at the definition to see how that works. Coverage territory, that part's easy. United States, Puerto Rico, Canada. That's usually it. And the U.S. territories, because that's considered part of the U.S. too. So U.S. and territories, Puerto Rico, Canada. Has to be during the policy period if it's an occurrence policy, and most of them are. And then if you switched insurance companies in particular, it can't be covering something that you knew about before the policy began. And hopefully that just makes sense. You can't retroactively insure, at least not very easily, certainly not for less than the cost of what it would cost to pay the claim. There are cases where we do retroactive insurance with known claims, but then those have to be added into the premium. They're either excluded altogether or they're covered, but they're added in to the premium. We're not going to allow this situation where, oh, I know I have a claim. Let me retroactively go out and try to get some insurance that covers it. That isn't how that works. That kind of cuts against the whole theory of insurance. Losses have to be random and accidental, like we talked about. Okay, in terms of what kind of money damages could you cause to somebody, there's really 3 types. We have special damages. Those can be measured. So my employee hits somebody with their car while they're in the course of employment. Okay, well, the bodily injury that we do to that person, we've damaged their car. Those are measurable. You know, they'll have medical expenses. They'll have damage to the vehicle. The vehicle can be fixed. We can quantify that fairly easily. Those are special damages. They might miss work. Also special damages because we can measure that pretty easily. If the injuries are bad enough, we might have general damages. And the biggest subcategory of general damages is pain and suffering. So we knock somebody out badly enough that they can't work for a few weeks. They have permanent damage. What's that worth? Well, that's not something you can measure. Somebody is in excruciating pain on a chronic basis for the rest of their life. They're probably entitled to some type of compensation, but you can't really quantify that. And that's not an easy thing to do. That's going to come down to a jury trying to decide, well, how much money should we award this person for dealing with pain and suffering? And those are general damages specifically because you can't quantify them. And then we have a third category of damages that are sometimes awarded by courts. Those are punitive damages. They're intended to punish. And almost always you cannot insure against those, right? Because the whole point is to punish. So if you could insure against them, it sounds like you're getting out of being punished. And there are some states that flat out say you cannot insure against punitive damages. More commonly, it's the insurance companies themselves that say, look, punitive damages, we're not going to insure you against. That category of damages is not something that we help you with. So special damages, general damages, yes. Punitive damages, no. Okay, so I didn't list every exclusion. There's not 16 on here, but we have enough to talk about. We talked about intentional injuries, always excluded. Contractual liability. So maybe you have ended up with a hold harmless agreement with a contract with some other company. Maybe you agreed to lease a building, something like that. And as a result, you agree to handle the premises risk from the owner. That's perfectly okay for you to do, but you need to endorse your policy to get that covered back in, or at least have the property listed on your declarations page, because contractual liability is excluded. This is exclusion B. Liquor liability is a little tricky. So this is referring to people who are in the business of providing liquor to their customers. There we're going to have a separate line of coverage. We've got dram shop insurance. We don't include that in the CGL. We handle that separately. Liquor liability, it sounds like, well, any type of liability that's related to alcohol is excluded. That's not true. Casual get-togethers, liability that comes from there would actually be covered. So if I'm hosting a work party and I serve alcohol and somebody goes from that party and goes on to cause damage, and that injured party wants to sue me for providing the alcohol, that's actually covered under the CGL. This liquor liability exclusion excludes only people who are in the business of dealing with alcohol. We're going to exclude workers' compensation. So if an employee gets hurt, they don't sue me on my CGL. They get to recover under workers' compensation. We're just making sure that the coverage is provided in the proper place. We're not going to do that through the CGL. We're going to do that through the workers' compensation policy. There's a pollution exclusion, and that can lead to very large amounts of liability. So that's worth knowing about, that pollution exposure is not something you can get from a CGL. If you're worried about that, you got to look at specialized coverage. Then we have aircraft, auto, or watercraft. Same thing here. We're hoping that that's going to be provided by a separate policy. You need a commercial auto policy if you're dealing with that. Mobile equipment, that's one that happens. Mobile equipment is most of the time we're talking about things that can move that aren't operated on public roads. So you get to some of this construction equipment stuff, cranes and bulldozers and the like. Remember, that was supposed to be covered. The property part of it is going to have to be covered in inland marine. The liability piece of it, in general, is going to have to be provided somewhere else. And there's a really good exhibit, Exhibit 8-2 in your book, can tell you a little bit about what mobile equipment is. And then it also defines auto there too. There's a war exclusion. We almost always see a war exclusion in insurance contracts. We have damage to insured's property. So, my property, I can't sue myself. That doesn't make any sense, right? When we get to insured's product and work, that's a little complicated. Oh, didn't realize I was still recording there. I thought I paused. So there's 4 exclusions that apply here to insured's product and work. One really good example here in the book, they say a remodeling contractor installs a faulty roof on a home addition. And then the owner makes a claim against the contractor for the faulty work for rainwater damage. Well, it'll exclude the cost of repairing the roof because that's your work. So that cost is not going to be covered under the CGL, but it would cover all the damage done by rainwater there. So more to say on that a little bit later. Personal and advertising injury, remember we're covering that in coverage B. So that's just one that we're moving. Electronic data, we've got a little bit of coverage in property. These are liability coverages, right? So this is going to be provided in a cyber policy, maybe in an inland marine policy for the property, but for the liability, you're probably going to need a cyber liability policy here. Electronic data. I store customer credit card information. Somebody steals it and uses it. And then the people sue me for failing to safeguard the information. That is an exclusion under coverage A. Then we have this fire legal liability coverage, and that's a little confusing. And what this is going to do is it's going to help define what's actually covered if there's a fire in a property that I lease. So it sounds like there's actually an exclusion here, but we're going to find out that what it does is it stipulates when that applies and when it doesn't. And most of the time in the declarations for a CGL, you will actually see a separate limit for this coverage, and there actually will be coverage. So it's kind of confusing that it shows up on a list of exclusions. And that's something you can read that over in your text if you're looking for some more explanation there. Okay, so coverage B, that covers personal and advertising injury liability. So false arrest, detention, and imprisonment. And you say, my goodness, how does a business end up with that? How about this? You catch somebody shoplifting in your store. What can you do? Well, you might want to check with your lawyer before you do anything, because if you hold that person there against their will, that could be false arrest. You got to be real careful with that. If you're detaining people, you don't have the right to do that. Only police officers can do that. The executive branch handles that, not private parties. So if you're going to hold somebody against their will, they could sue you for that. When you talk about malicious prosecution, somebody decides to sue me because I've sued them and I've done so in a way that was beyond my rights, beyond my expectations, egregious behavior. Wrongful eviction, if I'm a landlord. Wrongful entry, if I enter somebody else's building, they could sue my company for that. Slander or libel, that's a better example of personal and advertising injury liability. So slander, remember, that's spoken, harder to prove. Libel is written, a lot easier to prove. So if I've said something that is false and it damages somebody else's reputation, I could be sued for that. So let's say I did publicly accuse somebody of shoplifting from my store. Well, if it's true, you'd be okay. Truth is always a defense. Although if they sue you, you still have to go through the effort of defending yourself, and it might not be worth it. Probably smarter to just watch what you say. But truth is a defense. That's true. If you falsely accuse somebody and you damage their reputation, you can be held liable. And this is where you'd get some coverage for that. Coverage B usually has a separate limit from coverage A. These last two are similar. Copyright infringement, you use somebody else's trademark and they sue you, you'd have some coverage under coverage B for that. Or use of another's idea in your advertisement. That's tough because how do you prove that this idea was actually yours? There's a famous case that went on for a while from somebody who claimed that the Dorito taco was actually their idea. And Taco Bell has been selling those for some years now. I don't remember how that played out, but how could you prove that that idea came from you and not from somebody else? That would be extremely difficult to prove. And so that raised some of these issues. We got a whole long list of exclusions here as well. And some of it is not surprising. So knowing violation of rights of another. So if you use somebody's copyright and you use somebody's trademark and you knew, it sounds like it's intentional, that's going to be excluded. Same thing if you publish something with libel or slander. Well, if you publish, technically we're talking about libel. If you knew it was false, same thing. That sounds intentional. That's a problem. Anything that happened before the policy period, anything criminal stuff is always excluded. And then we've seen contractual liability and breach of contracts before. We've got a war exclusion. A pollution exclusion is a little bit harder for these kinds of losses to try to infer how a war exclusion or a pollution exclusion could play in. Electronic chat rooms, that's a big one. So if you have employees that are representing the company and making comments in electronic chat rooms, best be careful. Whatever they say there is not covered if somebody else claims damage. If you're in the media, that's a whole separate layer of exposure. And that's not something Coverage B is intended to help you with. You're going to need specific coverage there. Again, copyright infringement comes in as an exclusion. Oh, wrong description of prices. That's a good one, right? So I've got a vehicle that I want to sell for $20,000 and I accidentally leave a zero off and I advertise something that I'm selling this car for $2,000. And somebody tries to sue me saying, hey, you advertised you're selling this for $2,000. It's a wrong description of price. It's pretty clear what the problem is. The bar for that sort of thing is much, much higher, but it's excluded flat out here. That's just not a loss that insurance is going to deal with. So yeah, you've got the exclusions there for Coverage B, and they kind of fall into a couple different categories like we talked about, whether it's intentional, whether it's criminal, whether it's standard exclusions that we see elsewhere. Which brings us to Coverage C, medical payments. So here coverage is provided regardless of legal liability. And that's the key for Coverage C. So your limits are going to be a lot lower. It covers things that happen on the premises, and it covers accidents away from the premises as long as they result out of the insured's operations. Has to occur in the coverage territory. So U.S. territories, Puerto Rico, Canada. Here's another big part. It's got to be reported within 1 year of the accident. So we're going to impose a little bit of a time limit. If it's longer than that, fine, sue me. And we'll have to deal with this under Coverage A. And then the other part of it, for it to be handled under Coverage C, the person who's actually injured and suing has to agree to be examined by the insurance company's doctor. And that's not unusual. In insurance, when they pay, they generally want to be able to direct the medical care, or at least have their own personnel evaluate what the actual injuries are, so we have an opinion on that. We can argue, just because the insurer's doctor says this isn't a serious injury, that's not the end of it. But they have to be able to express an opinion on that, which is why they work this coverage in here. And if the other person doesn't agree to that, and they don't have to, then they're going to sue under Coverage A, and it's going to be a much more complicated process. So the incentive here is, look, this is relatively low limits of coverage, and if you want it to be covered, and if you want to get paid as the person who's suing, then you have to agree to have the insurance company doctor look at you. And again, after that process is completed, you might not be happy, and you still retain the right to continue to sue. But if you want to get paid under Coverage C, the no legal liability coverage, then we have to reach agreement there. Some exclusions here, anybody who's an insured. Again, you can't sue yourself. That doesn't make sense. Anybody who's hired by the insured, sounds to me like that belongs in workers' compensation. And if it's for sure, if it's an employee, then for sure it's workers' compensation and you don't get double paid. We can't do that. Anybody who's taking part in athletics, that's a special category that's excluded here. And then we're just going to copy the exclusions from Coverage A and apply them to Coverage C as well. So that's the easiest way to do that there. Okay, that between this lecture and the previous one, that's a pretty good overview of part one of the commercial general liability, the CGL policy. So I'll cut it off here and we'll go from there. Thanks a lot, you guys.